Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We will be starting the webinar in just a couple minutes, just after some folks are able to join the link. So give us a minute or two of patience and we will get started. Hi, everybody. For those of you who have just joined, we're just giving it a couple minutes to make sure that everybody can log on to the webinar, but we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Thanks so much for joining us today. All right, I think we can get started. We have a quorum. I just want to thank everybody who has taken time out of their day today to join us. I'm incredibly excited to be moderating this conversation on affordable housing decarbonization. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items. First, I want to give a big thanks to our funders at the Wells Fargo Foundation for their support of Turner's climate and housing work. We're really grateful to be able to be focusing attention on the issues and intersections between climate and housing. Second, we will be taking questions. If you want to ask something of our panelists, please put it in the Q&A section below. You'll see it at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please type your questions there. We'll spend some time at the end of the panel answering those questions, but we may also type your answers into the Q&A. So please put questions there. And finally, if you have to drop off or want to share this later with others, because the conversation is going to be so rich, we are recording this webinar and it will be available on our website. I'm joined today by a terrific panel of local and national experts. John Moon is the president of List Green, a national intermediary focused on expanding access to climate finance for affordable housing and community development organizations. Welcome, John. Amy Steitley, and this is a mouthful, is the Undersecretary for Strategy and Climate in the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities for the state of Massachusetts. I think I got it. Thanks for coming today. Like California, Massachusetts has set ambitious climate goals, and Amy has been working to identify and overcome barriers to affordable housing decarbonization across the state. Michelle Tran is the Sustainability Manager for the Chinatown Community Development Center, a place-based community development organization that manages a large portfolio of older, densely packed buildings that includes a large share of extremely low income and senior households. And last, but definitely not least, Andrew Dawson is the Senior Manager of Policy Advocacy for the California Housing Partnership, where he helps to advance state policies that support building more sustainable, affordable housing. Thank you all so much for joining us. Before we jump in, I want to set the stage with a brief overview of a report we will be publishing in early fall on overcoming barriers to affordable housing decarbonization. We decided to focus on this topic last year, given the unprecedented opportunity to deploy federal greenhouse gas reduction fund dollars for decarbonization efforts. We wanted to make sure that those funds were used effectively and equitably, and that barriers to decarbonization wouldn't prevent that important work from happening. Needless to say, federal funding for climate work is facing a very different future since January 20th. something I'm sure we'll come back to during the conversation. Even so, many states like California continue to advance ambitious climate goals related to decarbonization. This makes addressing the barriers no less urgent, even if the federal investments we need for large-scale implementation take longer to materialize. So first, to level set, could I get the next slide, please? What do we mean by building decarbonization? Decarbonization often entails 4 complementary strategies: electrification, replacing gas appliances with electric ones; installing renewables like solar panels; improving the insulation of buildings; and managing energy demand to reduce unnecessary use and pressures on the grid. Decarbonizing housing is critical for lots of reasons, not the least of which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Households use a lot of energy for heating, cooling their homes, for cooking, taking hot showers. To the extent that we can make those activities more energy efficient, we'll reduce more of the pollution that contributes to climate change. But critically, investments in decarbonization also improve people's lives, improving their ability to withstand hot days, for example. It can also improve resident health. For instance, research has found that children are significantly more likely to have asthma if they live in a home with gas cooking. Next slide, please. Second, what affordable housing are we referring to? This term can be used to refer to lots of different types of housing. In this webinar and in our forthcoming report, we're focused mostly on the subsidized housing stock, primarily properties funded by the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC, though I think Amy and Michelle may talk a bit about public housing as well. Certainly, overcoming barriers to decarbonizing non-subsidized affordable housing, also sometimes referred to as naturally occurring affordable housing, is equally important. We're putting a link in the chat of a new paper by Enterprise Community Partners that focuses on the unsubsidized market segment. I encourage you to check it out. At Turner, we chose to focus our research on LIHTC because it faces some unique financing and regulatory barriers to effectively deploying decarbonization funds. But you'll likely hear throughout this conversation that some of the barriers are similar, regardless of affordable housing type. Next slide, please. So what are those barriers? I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over this, but I did want to ground the panel discussion on a few key challenges so we can spend more time on strategies and solutions. The first challenge is funding. Turner has done a lot of research on how complex it is to compile funding to build affordable housing. Unbelievably, compiling the funding for decarbonization efforts is even harder. There's different programs, agencies, timelines, eligibility requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of the day, that funding is still rarely enough to cover upfront costs, especially when a building has a lot of other retrofit needs. There are also concerns over the long-term costs of equipment maintenance, especially for new technologies. The second set of challenges relates to administrative and/or bureaucratic hurdles. This includes getting all the lenders, investors on a LIHTC deal to approve taking out a loan to do the retrofits, which can be even more complicated if they don't understand the long-term benefits of the upfront investments. City planning and building permit departments can delay implementation, and coordination with utility companies can often also pose challenges. How rents and utility allowances in affordable housing are calculated can also make it harder for the property to pay back debt incurred from doing the retrofit. The third area of challenges is related to internal capacity for implementation, including having staff who can manage all of these complicated processes. Given the scale of need, developers also need more support in knowing which of their buildings should be prioritized for retrofits, as well as which investments have the greatest benefits. And critically, residents and their well-being need to be centered in all retrofit projects. and relocation during construction can be particularly expensive and challenging to do in a way that doesn't disrupt residents' lives. So now I'm excited to be digging into these issues and talking about strategies, solutions. John, I'm going to start with you. LISC was one of the organizations selected to provide funding under the landmark Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Before those funds were blocked by the Trump administration, you were actually successfully getting a lot of funding out the door. What did you see and learn in the early days of the GGRF?
First, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here with you, and just so excited to see a national leader like Turner focus its attention on what the affordable housing sector can be doing and around reducing emissions associated with affordable housing activities and the broader set of issues. So thank you for that. And a small correction, we were on the cusp of deploying our dollars before the termination. I think Climate United was able to get some transactions done as well. But I think, the bigger point here is that the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund program was a chance to really test the market and assess market demand for this kind of financing. So it was $20 billion. I'm not including the $7 billion for the Solar for All, which was more of a grant type of program. But the program was intended to jumpstart climate financing, focusing on low-income communities by working at scale to offer strong financial incentives for project developers to put together eligible pipeline transactions. For us at Power Forward Communities, which consisted of LISC, Enterprise Community Partners Rewiring America, we offered concessionary terms to help de-risk the transactions. And so, there could be things like contingent repayments with newer repayment sources, subordinated debt to maximize benefits to households and ensure affordability. And to do this at sheer scale, not only with Power Forward Communities, but other entities like Community Preservation Corporation, which was focused on the multifamily affordable housing sector. So our goal was, in many ways, decarbonization, but it was to lower utility rates, make homes safer through electrification, and support the developer community to help build the know-how to pull these projects together, and then also integrate job creation opportunities. So it really was a holistic approach. I think, one of the earlier surprises for us was the strength and the demand of the pipeline. To give you some sense, Enterprise Community Partners and LISC issued an intake or an interest form where we opened the window for a few weeks for projects across the country to be reviewed for eligibility. In that short amount of time, we had $1 billion of multifamily affordable housing projects. Now, of course, maybe not all of them could be funded or were at a immediately ready to go stage, but just the fact that we had such a strong pipeline of transactions. So when we actually looked through the data and the pipeline, there are a couple of things to note. First was there was probably more sophistication and capacity on the developer side than we had expected. And that was really encouraging to see, and that there was really strong market demand. The other side of it was that the majority of the projects were those stronger, sophisticated developers. We did not see as much from the smaller community-based organizations. And so I think that really speaks to the level of adoption, but also bigger issues around an equitable transition in ensuring that funding is available to all communities and all type of organizations that serve a broader range of communities. And so, for us at PFC, we were prioritizing then how do we start to build that capacity and the know-how at the smaller CDC and the smaller community-based organizations. So that's hopefully a snapshot of what the market demand looked like for us.
Thank you. Could you just take a minute and tell us why these projects need to be de-risked? for somebody who might be less familiar with sort of the importance of having these financing terms to de-risk these projects?
Yeah, I mean, for us, um, there's been a limited number of sustainable finance transactions that our risk folks in our organization would look at. And so, as a concrete example, when we have newer repayment sources with newer technologies, how reliable is the savings from cost savings associated with the performance of a heat pump system? Is it reliable so that we can repay? If there's some question, then we need some margin of error. And so, that's an example of how you start to de-risk with concessionary terms and frankly, some broader cushion for potential losses. But we're very careful in our underwriting to minimize those losses and recycle capital as much as possible. But that's the kind of cushion that we need. And there are a number of different other examples where we need building performance and actually performance of the units in order to better underwrite and have a level of confidence so that the rest of the market can come in with market rate capital eventually.
Great, thank you. Michelle, I'm going to turn to you next. John noted that there is a need to help place-based organizations access these kinds of funding, and that this is really important for equitable outcomes. Chinatown CDC is a place-based, really core, central, community-driven organization, and you have a portfolio of a lot of older properties that could really use retrofitting. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges you face specifically and how you're thinking about addressing them?
Yeah, I'd love to. The challenges, there's quite a few of them, but I'd like to focus on the people aspect of those challenges, which is both from a management point of view, for us as an organization, but also from a tenant and resident experience point of view. I think beyond the logistics of construction and funding and trying to get those loans to line up and all those deadlines to line up, what we try to think about is what is the impact on our residents? Because a lot of those construction projects actually do temporarily displace our residents. And one of our core missions is to essentially not do that. But we also can't leave residents in places where it could, in properties that are not being maintained very well and do need work to be done. It's a very complex situation because a lot of our residents may be older, may not have language capacity, may be not very mobile. So if you even move them a few blocks, they're now displaced from their community, or it's just harder for them to get things like groceries or just physically their mobility. I think a question we once had was, is it wise or responsible for us to relocate a resident that maybe is in their 90 for their health outcomes when the relocation itself can be a negative health impact? So ultimately, we want to make sure that the places that they're living in are happy and healthy, but the disruption to their routines is something that we need to consider when we are relocating them. And relocation is extremely expensive. So that's the burden of cost that we have to think about. And then also really complex. And our relocation teams are not big. I think there might be 3 or 4 people on our relocation teams, and they are moving, hundreds potentially of residents from one place to another across our portfolio of 38 buildings. And we are a small organization, but we do have resources. There are smaller organizations that do not have the staff capacity to take on that task. And that is on top of like all of our other things. So we also have to consider our maintenance and the long-term maintenance staff. Many of our maintenance guys have 3 or 4 properties, or sometimes even more, in their portfolio that they're running around to. So that is something that we are very aware of. Is a lot of it is timeline. A lot of it is how are we as an organization going to think about the work that we want to do. So I think we are very careful because we don't want to overextend ourselves, promise a bunch of things and then just not deliver on it. And we want to recognize that these are residents who are very vulnerable. They're often underrepresented. They're very low income. and we don't want to impact them more than we have to. There's a certain element of construction where you are just going to have to do certain things because ultimately the outcome is going to benefit them, but also us. But it's a hard thing to balance. I think that's one major challenge that is not really seen when you're looking at decarbonization work, because we know ultimately about that this is going to be the result, but the actual during construction impacts, that part is a lot harder and is a lot harder to talk about sometimes.
Thank you. And I'm going to come back to the resident piece in just a second. But I wanted to give Amy a chance to jump in. I think one of the biggest challenges we've been hearing in our research is sort of balancing retrofit needs with available resources. I know in Massachusetts, you've been trying to assess the existing affordable housing portfolio and trying to figure out what those needs actually are. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about that and the issues and tensions that are emerging from that work.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Carolina. So my very long title, Undersecretary for Strategy and Climate, indicates that I work in the state of Massachusetts and a secretariat focused on housing, zoning, and community development. I am what we call a Secretariat Climate Officer. We have a climate cabinet in Massachusetts where every secretary has to assign somebody to work with the governor's appointed climate chief. And that has been a very exciting and dynamic place for our state, different agencies, different secretariats to come together and try to untangle some of those challenges you mentioned at the beginning. So working with state government partners, developers, municipalities, housing authorities, nonprofits, lenders, advocates, utilities, regulators, that's my job. To try to partner with all to come to solutions. And one of the first projects that I undertook since changing into this role, which is a little less than 2 years ago, was to try and come up with a reasonable plan for all the deed-restricted affordable rental housing in Massachusetts, looking at sources, looking at upfront costs, and then, basically counting units and what we think the condition is across those portfolio. So the outcome, after a lot of meetings, lots of writing, lots of spreadsheet analysis, lots of back and forth, we were able to come to a consensus. And by we, I mean people in my secretariat and the housing development world, the public housing world, LISC Massachusetts, our HFA, our housing finance agency that houses the climate bank, people on the climate chiefs team. We were able to come with what I would say a very big, broad brush consensus that we could maybe do it. We could maybe get to net zero by 2050 with this specific portfolio of about 215,000 units, which, there's 1 million rental units in the entire state. So only a portion of the rental units. We thought we could do it. However, it was not going to be easy, and we were definitely relying on that $27 billion of greenhouse gas reduction funds, or at least a pro rata share of what we thought would come to us based on population and demographics. But aside from money, we also needed to ensure that every single preservation scope or recapitalization was an opportunity to decarbonize. So the highest energy efficiency building envelope standards, electrification, and renewable potential on every single project, which, is hard to enforce in a decentralized, non-single owner portfolio, some of which we fund directly, some of which we don't. So, but it was in the realm of possibilities between federal sources, including LIHTC, and our massive utility ratepayer funded energy efficiency program called Mass Save, which commits, billions of dollars to energy efficiency in the low income sector every year. We could maybe do it. In order to come up with that conclusion, which I throw with a grain of salt, this wasn't a published report with done by consultants where people did 4,000 projections after looking at 20,000 data points. We basically identified the universe we were talking about, public housing and deed-restricted subsidized multifamily housing. We set some parameters and assumption about what a light, medium, or deep retrofit package would cost. We subtracted that from what a regular preservation cost per unit would be, and we called that the incremental cost of decarbonization. And we basically did multiplication. And then we looked at every source, which was also a big task, and tried to add them all up to see if we could make the sources match the need. And we were getting close. We were getting close. And quite honestly, maybe could have used all the $20 billion of the GGRF in our own state, but we were getting close. And it was a good process because, one, it forced our partners to the table to agree on the biggest picture parameters and disagree. Even something as simple as how many affordable housing units are in the state of Massachusetts required quite a bit of debate because there's not a single entity that tracks everything. Cost was definitely something that people had a lot of opinions on, but we were able to lean on RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute in Massachusetts, and sort of a lot of data they had around cost of retrofits, and use their data set to sort of make, common sense assumptions. And, we were doing a little of this to set up for GTRF so that we could show that we had done some analysis and we had pathways and thoughts and financing tools and partners all together at our climate bank, at our HFAs, at our lending institutions. But regardless of the outcome of GGRF or the IRA, it brought us closer together and gave us sort of a shared language and baseline of understanding about what it would take to be net zero by 2050, which is mandated by law in Massachusetts.
Great. We'll come back to that too. It sounds like a lot of partner wrangling. And I have sympathy of trying to both find out how much affordable housing actually exists in the state, as well as what are all the different sources of funding for decarbonization. Andrew, I want to turn it to you because even as we're seeing the federal government really shift away from climate investments, California, Massachusetts, a lot of other states remain a clear leader. And I'm just curious in terms of what are the policy issues that are most important for affordable housing climate intersections that you're currently following in Sacramento? What should we be paying attention to there?
Yes, thanks for that. Just as a kind of a brief update about the California Housing Partnership, for those who don't know, which hopefully you do know, is we are a state-created nonprofit working on the preservation and production of affordable housing for low-income Californians. We do this in a number of ways. We do financial consulting on affordable housing developments. If you're part of a nonprofit, you might have used us previously. We also have a sustainable housing team that helps with the programs that the state and local governments have for decarbonization to help bridge those into our capital stacks. We have a research team, so we also have a lot of data. So if you want to know how many units of affordable housing there are, we have a pretty good idea on our website. And we also have a policy team, which is what I'm a part of, and I help lead our climate housing work. Back to the question about kind of how the federal government's shifting away from climate investments, what's California doing? There's a number of things that California can do. One of the biggest things that's happening right now is a cap and trade reauthorization that's happening within the state. This is a huge undertaking. The cap and trade program provides tons of funding for a number of different programs. One of the main ones is the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. So a lot of the advocacy that I work on is trying to maintain that allocation for that program. But that program also can fund other things, right? One example of this is the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program. This is a program that's going to start running hopefully later this year across the state to provide a direct install approach to decarbonization in low-income housing, including affordable housing and subsidized affordable housing. So that's a great thing to put into your capital stacks as you think about retrofits. The other big change on the federal side is that we're shifting from the 50% test on the bonds to a 25% test, essentially doubling the amount of tax credits in the 4% program. And we're also increasing the amount of tax credits in the 9% program. What that means is in the medium term, we're looking at a lot more retrofits coming in for re-syndications in the tax credit program, which is a great opportunity to start leveraging funding from other sources to decarbonize, right? Because if you're already getting these tax credits, we should leverage, the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program, for example, and other programs that the state offers to try to get the best bang for our buck when we do this re-syndication process. That's really exciting, but the state does have issues with its budget, right? And so we want to see kind of how that's going to play out in the Newsom administration, where the money is going to go in terms of climate programs, as well as how we can actually bridge that gap between the decarbonization programs and the housing programs. The last program I want to talk about is a solar and multifamily affordable housing program. This is a program that provides solar for deed-restricted affordable housing. It used to be only for existing buildings. However, we passed a law 2 years ago opening up to new construction. And so the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, is actually opening up a proceeding now to see how they can include new construction as well as master metered buildings and owner-paid utilities, right? This is going to be incredibly important for properties that serve unhoused populations, right? So PSH, things like that, where the owners pay for the utilities. Solar is a great component to help reduce the operating costs of these properties. So utilizing that program and those changes to that program is going to be really effective, hopefully, for people's properties. That's happening right now. The other caveat there is that the federal government did change the investment tax credit, so the ITC. So we hope that this proceeding is going to be relatively quick so that property owners can kind of get the ITC along with the SOMA incentive when they're applying for re-syndications, hopefully in the next couple of years.
So forgot to do unmute. Thank you. That sounds like there's a lot going on that people should be paying attention to. I'm going to start asking some questions of all of you to sort of pull out some of the themes that I think all of your initial presentations touched on. Also want to just remind people who are attending the webinar that we will do some Q&A. So please put any questions you might have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The first theme that I heard across all of your presentations is that this work requires really thinking about and prioritizing investments, both at the property scale and at the portfolio scale. And until we have a lot more resources, it's not going to be possible to do every single building and maybe not everything on every single building, right? And so, Andrew, you talked about solar and renewables as being really important to keeping energy costs low for residents and for property owners. I think, Amy, your work was also a little bit about sort of trying to identify the needs and also the potential costs of retrofitting different properties. Michelle, I know that you're thinking a lot about which properties to prioritize. Can maybe, Michelle, I'll start with you. And could you share a little bit about the trade-offs or how you think about which properties to prioritize and what to do on those properties?
Yeah. Honestly, a huge part of it is whether or not we can afford to do it at that property. That's just me being very frank. Sometimes there's opportunities. We always try to find state-funded or local-funded incentives. And I've found that typically those programs that are giving you incentives to do that work are going to favor larger buildings that are denser. You just get more money per unit that you have. Unfortunately, what that does is it leaves out, in our case, the most vulnerable portions of our portfolio. So we have a lot of like old, very small buildings that maybe are 15 to 20 units. But they're going to require the same amount of cost to do. But you're just going to get significantly less funding for them. So that's a consideration. So for us right now, the ones that have penciled out tend to be the multifamily, dense opportunities that are available among the portfolio. That's typically what we're looking at. Other places that we're looking for is if there's need, or if the building is in a place that can actually support those upgrades. Good example of that is if it hasn't had a roof replacement or has one that's coming up soon, you probably don't want to do a lot of work until that roof is replaced, because you're going to probably have to tear it all out and do it again, or just place them back where it is. So some of that has to do with timing. If we know there's a rehab coming up, if we know there's opportunities elsewhere that we can kind of take the sustainability and the decarbonization work and tack it on, that would be a good opportunity. But again, it does leave a good chunk of our portfolio that has the most need, unable to do the work that needs to be done. So we try to, at this point, go for whatever is actually plausible. But we still are trying to figure out what to do with those that are left out. So that's how we think about it so far.
Amy, what about you?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. I'm going to speak largely from a public housing perspective. So something unique about Massachusetts is we have a large state subsidized, not HUD subsidized, public housing portfolio and a sustainability program where we invest state capital bond funds directly into the decarbonization and the resilience of those properties. And we've been doing this since 2008, 9, 10, so 15 years. And the priorities were pretty simple back at the beginning. You looked at energy use and you looked at energy source. So oil first, right? Electric resistance heat first. Not only was it cost effective, but you kind of got the decarbonization, greenhouse gas reductions immediately from there. Now, and what Michelle was saying, and the regular maintenance schedules, taking advantage of any sort of envelope or equipment cost. If you're going to replace it with a high efficiency building technology. But now we're at the land of pretty much gas only, and the switch from fossil fuels to electric and renewable is a more challenging situation from a cost perspective and a cost effectiveness perspective, grid capacity, all kinds of stuff. So what we have done more recently in that portfolio is we've taken the 6 largest greenhouse gas emitting gas powered developments. They are large, as Michelle mentioned, and sent them out for deep energy retrofit scoping with a consultant team. And we got the costs back, and they're very, very high on a per unit. But it was still worth looking. And now we're in the process of thinking about how to break those scopes up and to attack things over time. Thinking about residents, disruption, value to residents and comfort, what we can afford, what will generate the most savings financially and from a greenhouse gas perspective, and being really strategic about what does a 0 over time kind of scope look like for each of those large portfolios, and which of them might actually get torn down and redeveloped into something new with LIHTC and addition of units. So also not investing where you feel like there might be a new opportunity to add density to a site and do more production. So that's how it all kind of gets put together. One of the interesting things about Massachusetts, well, first, the city of Boston and the city of Cambridge have mandatory energy reporting for buildings over a certain size. So people can really look at who are the large consumers within those cities. Well, the state also is implementing that. So we're going to have energy use data on all large buildings in the entire state very soon, which will really help us target.
Thank you. Yeah, John, I was hoping that you might jump in and also talk a little bit about how can we structure capital better to both meet the needs, but also to get to properties that Michelle was talking about, some of these smaller, harder to retrofit buildings.
Yeah, I might go a little bit. So I'll just respond to the first question. In my response of how do we basically prioritize a lot of really important questions, like do we go after the high emitting buildings and really do the work the Massachusetts is trying to figure out, doing a study around deep energy retrofit so that we could get more bang for the buck, or do we look for the ones that are really easy to do, not easy to do, but really is focused on cost savings? My answer would be, at least from a national perspective, all those are super important. But from a national perspective, I think one of the things that we found from the termination of the GGRF program was that we didn't have a political constituency to advocate on our behalf. And there are several reasons for that. The whole term decarbonization and just it gets really technical, and most people are just not going to understand what you're saying, and they're not going to be interested. If I, on the other hand, say I'm going to save you, 20% on your utility savings, I'm going to make your house safer because we're getting gas outside of your house, then there's interest. So I would say, at least one lesson learned is, how do we make this accessible? How do we prioritize things that really deliver value in a clear way to the people, the end users? How do we make this so that, because when you think about the GGRF program, this is a program that was, in its best form, intended to scale up the ability to save money on energy costs and make our homes safer. I mean, that's just on the housing side. Of course, we have the transportation, we have a distributed grid. All those are benefits ultimately accrue to communities and people. So what I would say is, like, when we think about the work, how do we think about ease, and how do we think about really uplifting different stakeholder value so that we can build a national movement around that? So then you think about the capital stack and the ranging of financing to make it easy. And one example of that, I'll answer your question, is we're offering a bridge finance package where we're trying to bridge all the different state and local incentives so that it's easier for the borrower. We're going to do the brain damage of, like, when all the payments happen, what are the risks associated with it, but we're going to front you the money so you don't have to think about that. We'll ask you questions to address, some risk issues, but we're going to just make it easy for you. And so that would be one example of how we can bring different money together, but also address this, challenge of multiple repayment sources and trying to make things easy and affordable.
That's sounds like a really important intervention. Andrew, John, Amy, Michelle, is that something that states can do as well, right? Like, how does, in the current moment, how does the state actually create an enabling environment that allows even the current resources to go further or be deployed more equitably or effectively? I don't know, Andrew, if you want to maybe start there.
Sure. Yeah, I think when we were having conversations with iBank, which is the infrastructure bank in California, about kind of what they can do, we talked about some of this bridge financing that John was talking about. Subsidized debt, that's always super helpful in general, right? We want low interest rates if we're even doing any debt in affordable housing. These are all things that the government can do and the state can do. The other thing that we've been working on, the CEC has been working with the Treasurer's Office on this for a little while, is how do we make it so that it's easy for affordable housing when they're applying for funding to just get the funding right away, right? Like, one of the big issues is all these hoops people have to jump through to get some of the funding, and it just makes it not usable, right? Or not worth it for the affordable housing developer to actually use some of this funding, right? So we want to make it as easy as possible, right? There's a state interest in building affordable housing generally. So there shouldn't be extra hoops to jump through if they're trying to decarbonize it and make a living or making low-income tenants a better environment for them to live in, right? So the state has been working on that. This idea of efficiency is really important, right? Especially as we have kind of budget issues in the state. We want to make sure our dollars and our time is used effectively and efficiently. And so bridging some of this financing and kind of this funding would be really helpful in the long run in getting money out as fast as possible and ensuring success of our programs.
I don't know if you want me to jump in, but I think from my perspective, some of the things that we have challenges with is the efficiency and then also the capital. A lot of times We just don't have the manpower to go and comb through all the different requirements that we have to match in order to make the funding work out. That takes a lot of time. And that time, and with our team, it's me. So I have to look at that for, 38 properties potentially. And it's just, you have to start picking opportunities you think are actually going to work out. And that really makes you look at the portfolio and go, okay, that cancels out a significant portion of our portfolio because it's just not going to happen in the next year or two. It feels a little bit like you're racing against time, but the timeline is a little wiggly. Like you just don't have a real understanding of how each of those programs and what their deadlines are going to be. Is until you're actually doing construction. And once you're doing construction, that's a whole other ball game. So that's another element of it. I think the other thing is that for us, a lot of the funding that we utilize requires some kind of upfront investment that certain projects just don't have. And so we have to go and look for other opportunities so that we can fund some of the pre-construction work prior to the decarbonization work, because a lot of times it's actually a lot more complicated decarbonization in comparison to energy efficiency, where you can just swap out the equipment. It requires a lot of time and design. So you need to get someone who's an engineer, who understands your building, who understands logistics, and that is going to push your timeline even further. So it might be something as simple as like some of our buildings are so old that the doorways will not fit equipment in. So you have to figure out what to do about the doorway, right? And that's not going to be covered in, generally speaking, in that kind of work because it's somewhat outside of the scope of decarbonization, but you need to do that prior to doing all the other work at the building. That's just an example. But those are the challenges that I think of. And if the state, I don't know, is a little more aware of that, or is a little like if they understand those challenges from a human perspective, I think their expectations of, things that we can actually feasibly accomplish will line up better. Because there's a lot of other things we're doing on top of what is required. Because of course we want to do what's required because that's typically for the, safety and health ultimately of this work. But we need to kind of align it with the realistic ability of organizations like mine, but even organizations much smaller than mine. We're actually considered a fairly large organization with a lot of resources. There are many tiny developers that are and management organizations who are housing really vulnerable people that have nobody. Like they're very, very small. Or they have very small portfolios, but they still have significant impact to our affordable housing in the city of San Francisco even, but across the region.
Real quick, I mean, if there's a way that you can just provide, whether it's state and local money, just to actually get some transactions, because part of the problem is like the novelty of applying a lot of different incentives into figuring out exactly what conditions and what under what circumstances they may be eligible. And if you could just get some sample like proof of concept transactions, then you can replicate and get some efficiency that way. And so we've seen it in other places where, funding the multiple capital sources and incentives is actually really helpful in jumpstarting the replication piece of the work. So I just wanted to add that. Sorry, Amy.
No, it's great. I wanted to talk about, I don't know that we've cracked the nut here in Massachusetts on complicated financing structures, but the group that worked on the plan that I talked about continues to meet. We're called the Affordable Housing Decarb Group. And we actually, one of our first kind of assignments we gave ourselves was to look at all our funding applications, the terms, the efficiency standards we were asking people to meet, the timelines, when the capital became available, the maximum award, and the questions on the applications, to see like how many different times were we asking people to do almost the same thing. And so what we did after looking at this, so one of a great team member who might be on the call today, Greg Abbey, who works in public housing, doesn't even work on the finance side, just took all the applications and merged them. And so that we could have what we would call like a common app or a single app for decarbonization, because there were programs coming from the Energy and Environment Secretariat, our secretariat, different financing entities that were our partners. And so we at least tried to align that if somebody was answering the questions, like it was like an update to an application, not a start from scratch when they were applying to all our sources. So that was one thing we did. And then we started sort of lobbying each other's entities when something was like out of the margins, like maybe the way that they were requiring to test on the standard at the end was above and beyond anyone else. So could we bring that those standards down a little bit to align with the rest of us? So that's one way we've done that. I mean, we do have state capital bond funding, and then one-time funding from the state that seeded our climate bank, which provides low interest and no interest loans. Similarly, our bond financing does that. And then our Energy and Environment Secretariat is giving grants, which was very interesting because grants don't always work for LIHTC properties. And so it's been a really interesting, and then there's subsidies or no, incentive payments. That's what they are from the utilities. So we have incentive payments, grants, and no interest, low interest loans. And often they're all going to the same projects. So I think even some awareness about that on this working group, and then how we can shift our practices, our funding rounds to even be aligned. There was a moment where the Energy Environment was announcing their decarb awards, and then the housing folks wanted to announce ours, and then we looked and a lot of the projects were the same. So this is the kind of thing that we can work on as a state, and I don't know if California is, but I feel like we've made some progress in Massachusetts.
Great. I want to turn to a couple of the questions in the chat or in the Q&A. I feel like some of them have already come up naturally, the importance of coordination, and that the state can really provide both a function around that coordination, but also maybe provide technical assistance and pre-decarb funding to help organizations do that planning process. But there's also a question about sort of best practices for addressing residents' needs during a decarbonization project. And Michelle, I wonder if you could just talk briefly about some of the things that you do to minimize the negative impact on residents, or if you've learned something about relocation that could be helpful.
So I think it depends on whether or not relocation is required for that project. There's kind of pros and cons to both. We did a project where we were able to decarbonize a property without relocating them, but that comes with a lot of challenges of people coming in and out. But it could be, it's like short-term disruption for long-term gain. But for very major construction projects, my recommendation, or what we do at our organization, I'm not on the reload team, is to make sure that resident services, property management, and the relocation team are involved. They are very, very direct. They interface with the residents on every level, and also there's some regulatory requirements where we are required to notice them significantly ahead of time. We're supposed to work with them, and we need to relocate them back into their homes under a certain period of time. I believe it's 12 months from start of construction. So there are some things that protect the residents on that end, but a lot of our residents are monolingual, so having translators, just having a lot of conversations significantly earlier than construction is even going to be on the ground is very, very helpful. So that's something I would think about. And I think you do need to create a strategy around that, and kind of learn from it and continue to talk about best practices, because some of these residents do have very significant individual needs.
Just really quickly, I mean, if it's a project, a LIHTC project is undergoing a major rehab as part of its cycle, then you're going to have to maybe displace residents anyway, and so then you could actually build in the work at that point in time as part of larger work, because a lot of times deep energy retrofits can be actually complementary to what you're doing on the bigger retrofit side.
There's another question in the chat that I'm going to reframe slightly, but it relates to the fact that climate change is happening. We're seeing more severe weather events, and we're having to respond to those events. We're also seeing the need for more air conditioning in properties that might not in the past needed air conditioning. So it's possible that you make these changes and energy demand and costs goes up, right? Because of unmet demand in some of these places. How are you all thinking about balancing these challenges between wanting to decarbonize, mitigate climate change, but also really needing to increase the resilience and adapt to the changes that are already happening? I'll let anybody take it first.
I could try to take a stab at it first, but I'm sure I'm not going to answer everything here. I think this is like a really big conversation happening at the Capitol. This idea of affordability and kind of California's climate strategy and how does that relate to affordability. The way I'm kind of looking at it, and we're kind of looking at the partnership, is people spend most of their money on housing, and the second most thing they spend their money on is transportation, right? So in the cases where you are building more affordable housing and you're saving tenants, $1,000 on rent, if their energy bill goes up $100, they're still netting $900 there, right? So there's that aspect to it. When it starts to go in construction or like existing buildings where energy bills are going up, that is really difficult. I mean, installing solar is going to help to some degree because you get the tariff structure there. But it is really difficult when utility bills are going up. I mean, this is a problem with tariff on bill financing as well, where you can't guarantee savings. And so how do you actually finance some of this stuff becomes an issue. The other thing that I'm just hearing generally is like residents need to learn how to use some of the equipment, right? Heat pumps work very differently than traditional air conditioners. And so then teaching residents how to use a heat pump more effectively can actually help with some of these issues. But again, energy bills are going up, and I think, from a housing perspective, the more affordable housing we can provide, the more ability people can handle when bills go up, depending on, PG&E's prices and things like that.
Yeah.
I know it's not the best answer, but that's what I got for you.
Yeah. Very quickly, I would say we definitely need to advocate for some kind of utility allowance change in structure at the minimum. Something needs to happen there because the electric bills are really expensive. It's really hard to convince our residents to move to electricity when gas is currently cheaper in most of our portfolio.
I was just going to add that they are restructuring the discount rates for utilities in Massachusetts. And most of the folks living and the income restricted, and definitely those in public housing and with a housing voucher, they are automatically, if you have a housing voucher or a public housing resident, you are automatically enrolled through you're automatically income eligible. We're trying to at the state level make it so you don't have to apply, that like we can share data with client data with the utilities, and they can enroll them, and it will be an opt-out on the discount rates. I don't know if the math's really gonna work in the long run, but hopefully that takes at least one barrier of getting those discount rates. They're also working in Massachusetts on an air source heat pump rate discount rate, a specifically air source heat pump discount rate, and something called like a moderate income discount rate. Now, all of these discount rates have to come from somewhere. They come from a cost of the investor-owned utilities and the ratepayers. So it's not like the magic answer, but there's something to that maybe. I mean, as we try to creatively think about this question.
All right, well, we are almost at time, so we're going to do a super fast lightning round. As the federal government dismantles climate agenda wholesale, what's the one thing that you want local or state governments to do to step in? What can we be asking of local and state governments? It's got to be fast.
I'll just say subsidized lending, bringing in CDFI capital, offering and complementing long-term lending sources. I mean, just we need more subsidy into the system that can be leveraged with other private funding.
I would
Great.
say communicate and create efficiencies within the system.
I would just say give us a reason to do it. Like just one that is very easy to convince people of, that doesn't require me to make giant presentations about it. Like an easy, this is the obvious answer.
And Amy?
Well, I work at a state, so um, I can tell you what we are doing is we are trying to streamline permitting, and we are creating those early technical assistance programs so that more properties, and particularly smaller, lower capacity property owners, are able to enter into this market.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much for joining me today and for your insights. Thank you to everybody on the webinar who has joined us today. We will be sending out a recording. There's some resources in the chat. Thank you all, and have a great day.